My father froze mid-laugh, and I want you to understand that my father never freezes. Richard Calloway, my father, a real estate developer who'd built his name and his charity gala guest list on the same foundation of other people's admiration, had a laugh that filled rooms on command. But that night, standing on the marble steps of the Calloway Foundation's autumn gala, his laugh caught somewhere in his throat and just stopped. He'd been mid-sentence, telling the man beside him, a city councilman he'd been courting for a zoning favor, that his daughter was still finding herself. You know how it is. Some kids just aren't built for real work. And then the black SUV pulled up to the curb and I stepped out of it, and two men in dark suits and earpieces fell into step half a pace behind me, and my father's mouth stayed open around a word he never finished. To understand how it came to this, you have to go back 6 months, to a dinner table in the same house where he raised me, where he first called me a paper pusher to my face. It was a Sunday, the kind of Sunday my family treated like a mandatory performance review. My mother, Eleanor Calloway, my mother, a woman who curated her family's image the way other people curate art collections, had set the good china, which meant someone important was coming, in this case, my father's business partner, a man named Whitfield who was deciding whether to invest in my father's next development. I'd flown in on a 48-hour leave from Fort Belvoir, still adjusting to civilian clothes after years in uniform, and I made the mistake of mentioning, when Whitfield asked what I did, that I worked in a logistics and liaison capacity for a federal interagency office. It was true. It was also the most I was legally allowed to say. My father didn't let the sentence breathe before he laughed and said, "She means paperwork. Our little soldier pushes paper for the government now. Real exciting stuff." Whitfield chuckled politely. My mother refilled his wine. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap the way I'd learned to do in briefings where you don't get to react. And I said nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining things I wasn't cleared to explain, to people who'd already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. That was the inciting wound, if you want to call it that, not the words themselves, because I'd heard versions of them my whole life, but the fact that he said them to a man he was trying to impress, using me as the punchline to make himself look bigger. I remember thinking, very clearly, very calmly, fine, let him believe it. There would come a night, I told myself, where the record would speak so loudly he wouldn't be able to laugh over it. I just didn't know yet how soon or how public that night would be. My family's story about me had calcified years before that dinner. In their telling, I was the daughter who'd thrown away a full academic scholarship to enlist at 19, who'd spent her 20s playing soldier instead of building a career like my older brother had, a corporate law track my father bragged about at every opportunity. What they didn't know, because I never told them, was that the scholarship had never fit me the way they imagined it did, and that enlisting had been the first decision in my adult life that felt like mine instead of a line item in my father's plan for the family name. What they also didn't know was what happened after basic training, the aptitude scores, the language program, the transfer into an interagency fellowship that eventually placed me inside a small, unglamorous-sounding office that coordinated protective intelligence assessments for senior federal officials and visiting dignitaries. Paper pusher was, in a narrow and almost funny way, technically accurate. I did push paper. Some of that paper decided who got a security detail and why, and how many agents, and for how long, and under what threat picture. My father never asked a single follow-up question in 8 years. He'd decided the ceiling of my life the moment I didn't go to law school, and he never looked up again. At work, a different version of me existed, one my family had never met. My supervisor, a soft-spoken former Marine named Dana Reyes. My supervisor, a woman who did not hand out praise she didn't mean, once told me in a hallway that my threat assessments were the ones junior analysts were told to model their own after. I didn't tell my parents that. I didn't tell them about the time I flagged a discrepancy in a visiting foreign delegation's manifest that turned into a genuine, quietly handled security matter. The kind of thing that never makes the news because the whole point of doing the job well is that nothing happens. I didn't tell them because I'd learned, a long time ago, that my father didn't want updates on my life. He wanted confirmations of the story he'd already written about me, and anything that contradicted the story got waved off as exaggeration, or luck, or, well, they let anyone do that these days. I stopped bringing him the truth because he kept returning it unopened. The one person in that house who ever seemed to notice the gap between their story and my reality was my younger brother, Sam Calloway. My brother, an easygoing architecture student who'd never had to fight our father for a single ounce of approval. Sam wasn't fighting my battles for me. He never fully understood the shape of them. But I remember him catching my eye across that same dinner table the night of the paper pusher comment, giving me a small, apologetic wince, the universal sibling code for "I saw that, and I'm sorry, and I don't know what to do about it." Later that night, he knocked on my old bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "You know that's not fair, right? Whatever you actually do." I told him it was fine. It wasn't fine, but it also wasn't his fight to win for me. And some part of me, the part that had been trained to assess situations rather than react to them, had already started quietly building toward a different kind of resolution, not revenge. I want to be precise about that, because revenge was never the goal. I just wanted, one day, for the truth to be too loud to talk over. So somewhere in the weeks after that dinner, without telling a single member of my family, I let the calendar do what I couldn't. The strategy, if I can even call it that, was almost embarrassingly simple. I didn't do anything. I didn't correct my father. I didn't send my mother a resume update or a promotion announcement. I didn't post anything, explain anything, or drop a single hint at the next family gathering that anything had changed. What I did do was accept a reassignment that had been in motion for months, a lateral move into a role advising directly on protective operations for a rotating slate of senior officials and their public engagements. The kind of role where you don't get a title people recognize, you get a badge that opens doors people don't ask about. And when my new office chief, a measured, unflappable woman named Director Okafor, mentioned that one of the officials on our details calendar had a public appearance coming up at a private charity gala in my hometown, hosted by a developer named Calloway, I sat very still for a moment and then said, in the most professional voice I owned, that I was familiar with the venue and would be glad to lead advance coordination personally. Nobody in that room knew what that sentence cost me to say without my voice shaking. I requested the assignment through entirely normal channels, on entirely normal merit, and I did not tell my family I was coming. I spent the 2 weeks before the gala the way I spend every assignment, walking the venue, running the guest list, coordinating with the local field office, briefing the detail on entrances and exits and sightlines, and if some small, unprofessional corner of my mind noted that one of those exits was the same side door I used to sneak out of as a teenager, I kept that thought exactly where it belonged, which was nowhere near the job. My father sent one email that week, forwarded from my mother, a reminder that the gala had a black tie dress code, nothing military please, a line I read twice and then closed without responding. He had no idea I'd already walked that ballroom floor twice in the past 10 days with a headset in my ear and a floor plan memorized down to the inch. He thought he was hosting a party. I was already working it. And on the night itself, when the black SUV pulled up to the curb and I stepped out first, the way protocol required, I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the calm before a door you've been standing in front of for years finally opens. He was mid-laugh when he saw me. I told you that already, but I need you to sit in it with me for a second, because I'd imagined that moment probably 100 different ways over the years, and none of them looked quite like this. He was standing on the top step in his tailored tuxedo, gesturing with a champagne flute at the councilman beside him, delivering some version of the paper pusher line I'd heard my whole life, and then his eyes caught mine across the courtyard, and the sentence just died. I watched the recognition land, then the confusion, then something closer to alarm as the two agents flanking me, Agent Torres and Agent Whitmore, professionals doing their jobs and utterly indifferent to my family drama, fell into a formation they'd run 1,000 times before, scanning the crowd, angling their bodies just slightly toward mine. My mother appeared at his elbow with her hand pressed flat against her chest, the way she did when she was recalibrating a story in real time. Sam was somewhere near the bar, and I saw him go still, then break into a grin he was clearly trying to smother out of respect for how serious everyone else looked. I didn't stop to explain anything. That wasn't my job that night, and honestly, some small vindicated part of me enjoyed letting the silence do the work I'd been denied the chance to do for 8 years. I moved through the entrance the way I'd been trained to, scanning, calm, present but not performing, and it was Agent Whitmore who leaned in slightly as we crossed the threshold and said, quiet enough for only me to hear, "Ma'am, they're ready for you. Ma'am, not kid, not our little soldier. Ma'am," in a room my father had built specifically to be admired in, from a man in a suit my father would never in his life get to wear. What "they're ready for you" meant, in practical terms, was that the evening's program included a brief public recognition, a plaque, a few words from the visiting official my team was protecting, thanking the interagency partners who'd coordinated the event's security detail, and my name, my actual title, was on that program. I hadn't arranged that part. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a better story if I'd engineered the whole thing, but I hadn't. That recognition existed independent of my family entirely, a courtesy extended by an official who had no idea whose father owned the ballroom. I just hadn't told anyone in my family it was coming, because I'd stopped expecting them to care, and because some quieter, more truthful part of me needed them to hear it from someone else's mouth instead of mine, needed it to land as fact instead of as my daughter's version of events. The MC for the evening, a board member of my father's foundation, called for the room's attention roughly 20 minutes later, and read from a card that named the federal office I served, the operation I'd coordinated, and, briefly, formally, the way these things are always said, my rank and my role on the visiting official's protective detail. I stood near the side of the stage in my black tie dress with my earpiece tucked discreetly out of sight, and I watched my father's face while a room full of the people he most wanted to impress applauded for the daughter he'd spent 8 years calling a disappointment at his own dinner table. Whitfield, the business partner from that Sunday dinner, turned to my father with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, something between confusion and the beginning of real respect, and I watched my father's mouth open and then close, because for possibly the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say that would make him look bigger in that moment. The story he'd been telling about me for 8 years had just been read aloud, in his own house, by someone who wasn't me, and there was no version of paper pusher that survived contact with the room's applause. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that too, because it would have been easy, and some tired, wounded 19-year-old part of me wanted to. But I'd spent too many years learning that the point of good work is that it speaks for itself, so instead I gave the room a brief, professional nod, resumed my position near the entrance, and let the evening continue exactly the way it was supposed to. My father found me 20 minutes later near the coat check, his champagne flute forgotten somewhere, and he opened his mouth. I could see him reaching for a joke, a recovery line, some way to fold this new information back into the story where he still got to be the one in control of the narrative. And then he just stopped, again, for the second time that night, and said instead, quietly, "I didn't know." I told him, just as quietly, that he'd never asked. And then Director Okafor caught my eye from across the room, and I excused myself, because I was, technically, still on duty, and my job that night had never been about him. The weeks after the gala did the thing that public reckonings rarely do in real life, which is nothing dramatic at all. No shouting match, no tearful apology scene, just a slow, visible recalibration in how my family talked about me, or more accurately, stopped talking about me the way they used to. My father tried, in his own limited way, to fold the story into something he could take partial credit for, telling one relative that he'd always known I was destined for something serious, which I let go, because correcting him would have required more energy than his approval was worth to me anymore. My mother asked, for the first time in years, actual questions about my work, small ones, careful ones, the kind of questions that told me she was recalibrating too, just more honestly than he was. And Sam called me 2 days later, not to talk about the gala exactly, but just to talk, the way brothers who've finally seen each other clearly are supposed to talk. And near the end of the call he said, half laughing, "You could have told me you were basically running the room," and I told him some things you can't explain. You can only let someone see. My career didn't change direction because of that night. The promotion I earned the following spring, into a senior advisory role overseeing protective coordination for an entire regional office, had been building for years before my father ever saw me step out of that SUV. But something in how I carried myself did change, some old, quiet need to be understood by people who'd already decided not to understand me finally loosening its grip. I stopped waiting for my family's version of respect and started noticing how much respect I'd already earned in rooms they'd never been invited into. Director Okafor promoted me not because of a gala, but because of 8 years of work she'd actually watched, and when she shook my hand in her office and said she was glad the right people had finally seen what she'd known for years, I realized that was the sentence I'd been waiting my whole life to hear, and it hadn't come from where I expected. My father texted me on my birthday that year, months after the gala, a short message that read, "Proud of you, should have said it sooner." I looked at it for a long time before I responded, turning it over the way you'd examine a document for authenticity, checking it against 8 years of evidence to the contrary. In the end, I wrote back 3 words, "Thank you, Dad," polite, complete, and closed, the way you sign off a file you've decided is finished. I didn't write back with warmth I didn't feel yet, and I didn't write back with the anger I'd earned the right to. I wrote back with the calm, level distance of someone who no longer needed his verdict to know her own worth, because I'd finally learned the truth every paper pusher eventually learns. The record doesn't need to be believed to be true, it just needs, eventually, to be read. If there's one thing I'd want anyone sitting where I used to sit to take from this, it's that you don't have to argue your way out of a room that's already decided who you are. Sometimes you just have to keep doing the work quietly enough and long enough that the truth ends up walking in wearing a badge instead of asking permission to speak. If this story landed for you the way I hope it did, stick around. I've got more of these, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one.